So, dear friends, dear colleagues, let's start our public event. Nice to meet you. Nice to see you again, and nice to see other guests. First, let me say one thing. What we are witnessing in Iran today show how important the civil society is to initiating great social upheaval. And we in Europe have greatest respect for the courage of the people in Iran, and especially the women living and fighting under these very complicated situations and conditions. And so many protesters were beaten in the streets. So many protesters were shot in the streets, and so many people died, women and also children. And that's why I think I ask you to rise from your seats for a moment of silence, and let's think about that. Thanks. If you speak about Iran, we will often talk about the JCPOA, and this is important, about missiles, about Iran's role in the proxy wars, about the human and democratic rights situation in the country and sanctions. But we decided, together with Carnegie Europe and with my colleague Ernest Urtasun, MEP from the Green Group and the standing rapporteur, Iran rapporteur in the AFET committee, we decided to focus on bridging the gap between politicians and women as representatives of a strong civil society in Iran. But we decided about this concept. We didn't expect that women would lead a movement for change in Iran now. However, we knew that changing the situation in Iran of women is a key of progress in this country. Women and girls in Iran are not only victims, and we shouldn't speak only about victims. They are active in the movements, and it is necessary to see what do they do to defend their basic rights to self-determination and a life in dignity. Women had to shoulder the effects of a year of sanctions and a failed economic policy in Iran, of the Iranian regime. The situation became more and more unsustainable, and women, young people, men from across society, LGBTIQ and other, also a lot of workers, they all feel this is time for a changing in Iran. Instead of acknowledging the deep-seated social, economic and political problems have been building up in Iran, those we see a lot of violence against protesters. It pains me to see what has happened in this country in the last months, but I think we all feel it's time to change. The world has changed. Nobody can close the eyes in view of what is happening in Iran. Instead of simple answers, smart policies are needed to support the demands of the Iranian society for change. Let's speak about that, our possibilities, our solidarity, what can we do and how can we come to joint activities. I'm happy to see you all again, and let's start with our conference, and I give the floor my colleague Ernest.
Thank you, Cornelia. Thank you all for being with us. I think that today is also a good moment, well, firstly to express our solidarity with every single woman and men in their mobilization for a better future for Iran, for their freedom, for their life. to express also the solidarity with the victims and with the injured after the repression on the side of the Iranian regime. And the intention of Cornelia and myself with the session we're doing today and the discussions we have had during the day is to better understand, and I think this is going to be important in the session today, what is going on the ground, and to better fine-tune the European response, which I think this is why we are here. Politically, we have all the intention to support what is going on, but we need to calibrate well how to better support the activists, how we better protect human rights defenders, and how to approach the Iranian regime in the current circumstances. I think this event comes at a very timely moment. It was planned, I have to say, before the latest events, because I have to thank particularly Carnegie for the engagement that we have had in the last already 2 years or 3 years, basically, since the beginning of the legislature, where we started a dialogue with EU officials, parliamentarians, and civil society organizations in Iran and in the diaspora. And I think that that channel of communication that we already established some time ago now is a fundamental tool to better understand and to better support what is going on in the country. So I would like to thank so much Carnegie and Cornelia for all the work that has been done in the last years. I think that at the moment, the most important for us is to create safe spaces for civil society in Iran. In a moment where we know that there is a shrinking space, the liberties have been, in Iran particularly, but not only, but in Iran particularly, have been shrinking in the last years. I think for us, from the European Parliament, it is our responsibility to provide safe spaces for dialogue and for engagement, and this is what exactly we are trying to do, and this is the whole purpose of the event that we will be having today. So, as you see in the program, we have some guests with us that will be providing some input before the discussion. Cornelius Adebahr from Carnegie Europe will be moderating the session. But before we start the panel, it is really a pleasure to welcome Ambassador Ronner-Grubačić, which fortunately we have had the chance to work in other areas, and particularly in the gender equality agenda foreign policy for the EU, as in his capacity of Ambassador for Gender Equality and Diversity. I would like to thank Ambassador for being with us, for your work and your engagement on those matters, and also because I think that the work that you are developing on the ES is extremely relevant when it comes to Iran and what is going on. So I think that it's very welcome that you're with us to address the audience as a keynote speaker at the beginning of the conference. And I will pass you immediately the floor. So thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you so much. And let me also start by thanking, first of all, of course, the initiators, so you, Ernest, and Madam Ernst, for giving me the floor and organizing this event, indeed together very much with Carnegie. For me, it's really great to have this opportunity to set the scene for this discussion that I hope indeed will focus on the one hand on the EU's approach towards Iran, but also and maybe more particularly on the way to realize meaningful engagement with Iranian civil society. And as was already mentioned, indeed this is a very timely conference or discussion, not only because it allows us to have this exchange and to reflect on one of the most visible and important trends in the ongoing protests, namely the role of women in Iranian civil society, but also because today is the 8th of December, and that is just a day, as I'm sure all of you know and better than I do, a day after the Student Day in Iran, the anniversary of the 1953 killing of 3 students at the University of Tehran, and traditionally a day when students' sit-ins and strikes are flaring up across the country, amidst the continuing protests, of course, that have been going on for months now. So, of course, the killing of Mahsa Amini at the hands of the Iranian morality police continues to shock us, continues to shock the EU. And the EU has called for her death to be duly investigated and for those who are responsible for her death to be held accountable. But today, unfortunately, it is no longer only her death that shocks us. And I'm grateful for the moment that we just had to commemorate the death of all the peaceful protesters that have lost their lives, expressing their dissent by exercising their fundamental right to assemble and protest. And clearly, the current uprisings reveal deep frustration. The protests and the prominent role that women play in them clearly show that this is about much more than the wearing of the hijab, no matter how symbolical this is, and I would say especially the burning of them. Iranians, women and men, boys and girls, have taken to the streets to challenge the status quo. This is a nationwide protest movement that is putting into question the political, religious, and cultural foundations of the Shiite clerical regime. The key demands of the current protests, with women at the forefront, are respect for fundamental human rights, dignity, and, I think it needs to be underlined, real change. Iranian women have always participated in protest rallies, but this is the first time that their demands have been regarded as the nation's demands. They call on Iranian authorities to uphold their fundamental rights, the rights of Iranian citizens irrespective of ethnic origin, race, religion, gender, age, sexual orientation, or any other consideration. And despite being jailed and having members of their families intimidated, these women, men, girls, and boys, are persisting in their battle, posing a serious challenge to the regime. The EU has made it very clear on several occasions, both in the diplomatic context and publicly, that it expects all perpetrators of violence to be held accountable. And I would like to mention in this context too that the EU has a strong, unequivocal and long-standing opposition to the death penalty in all times and in all places and circumstances. Therefore, we are appalled by the Iranian officials' calls for the use of the death penalty against protesters and reports that such judgments have been passed. We have also on various occasions recalled that under international law, the prohibition of torture is absolute. The High Representative, Mr. Josep Borrell, in his 25 September declaration on behalf of the 27 member states, also urged the Iranian authorities to strictly abide by the principles enshrined in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, to which Iran is a party. And this 25 September declaration not only codified the position of the EU and its member states with respect to the situation of the protests in Iran, but also has paved the way for further coordinated actions. And as I suppose most of you know, the Council, the Council of Ministers has adopted 2 rounds of restrictive measures, sanctions, against individuals and entities from Iran as part of the EU response to the killing of Mahsa Amini and the violent crackdown on the demonstrations. And I want to say very clearly that this approach will continue. The EU commitment to support the legitimate demands of Iranian citizens extends to UN fora as well. The EU co-sponsors the annual UNGA, so General Assembly resolution on the human rights situation in Iran. In addition, we support the mandate of the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Iran. And I had a meeting with the rapporteur just yesterday, where we agreed to stay in close touch, also with the purpose of jointly considering future steps. Furthermore, we engage actively with the Human Rights Council in Geneva. More particularly, all 27 EU member states co-sponsored the resolution that was adopted very recently on the establishment of an independent international fact-finding mission to investigate human rights violations in Iran in the context of the protests that began on the 16th of September. Strengthening accountability for human rights violations across the world is at the core of EU's external policy approach. So to sum up, the EU will continue to be engaged on and react to concerns with respect to the human rights situation in Iran. And by doing so, I would say also by my presence here today, we want to show to the Iranian people, and especially to the Iranian women, that they are not alone. The EU listens to their voice and demands and will continue to support their efforts as well as the efforts of all Iranians to uphold their fundamental rights, meaning, among other things, also improved living conditions, the right to gender equality and social liberty for all Iranian citizens. And by saying this, I also imply that in our view, isolating Iran, as many are suggesting these days, cannot be the answer. Engaging with Iran at the political level is more important than ever. As EU representatives, we will continue to use every opportunity in our direct contacts with Iranian authorities to urge them to ensure respect for the fundamental right of all Iranians, women and men. As part of our comprehensive policy approach towards Iran, dialogue and critical engagement will continue to play a crucial role alongside other tools at our disposal. And let me conclude by saying that access to information about what is happening in Iran has become more difficult because of internet being closed. And fortunately, we have you, representatives of Iranian civil society abroad, to keep us informed. So I would like to thank you for doing that, for your quick reactions and the intense use of social media, using your personal and direct contacts in Iran to shed light and provide information on the situation on the ground. I cannot overstate the importance of the work that you are doing, also for the work that I'm doing. And I'm looking forward to having more opportunities like this today to take stock and reflect on the way forward together with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Ronner. Thank you also to MEPs Cornelia, Ernst, Urtasun. I'm Cornelius Adebahr, an associate fellow with Carnegie Europe, and on behalf of myself and my dear colleague Barbara Mittelhammer, I'm very pleased to welcome you to this public event today. Also welcoming those who are not in this room. It is live streamed on the European Parliament's web page, and it is an opportune picture, I would even say, to have representatives of the European Parliament, of the EAS, and the main institutions, providing the framework for the civil society activists that we could have brought here inside the European Parliament. These are very tense circumstances, as you all know, but we are working on a civil dialogue. We've had already an extensive discussion this morning with representatives of the European Union institutions. We have tried to get deeper into the issues, trying to look at real-world problems and solutions to which the European Union can contribute, and we're very happy that we can do this now on the public stage. So without presenting to you the entire Stella panel that is sitting next to me, I would like to go one by one, introduce them first, and direct a question to them. And this way we can develop maybe a more in-depth picture of the situation in Iran and of the needs that the Iranians, women, men, young and old, that are taking to the streets, what they need and how the European Union could respond. I'm starting with Sussan Tahmasebi. She's the director of Femina and a well-known women's and human rights activist working throughout the region in Iran and around the Persian Gulf, the MENA region. And I'm asking you this question. We titled the session, A Feminist Revolt, How Women and Civil Society Are Leading Change in Iran. Let us know a little bit, why is this revolt a feminist revolt? How does it build on the women's movement in Iran that has long roots?
Thank you very much for organizing this really important event and for paying attention to Iran. It's very important to us that civil society voices get heard in capitals and in countries by countries that can help bring attention to human rights issues and to the needs of civil society. So to answer your question, I want to start with the death of Mahsa Amini. Jina is her Kurdish name. This beautiful young woman who was killed while she was in police custody. And her death triggered a response across the country by all Iranians. They empathized with her because her death was so senseless, such an incredible waste of life for something so trivial. And I think a lot of people empathized with her situation. Her brother and others who were there told the story of how she was arrested. She was visiting Tehran from a small city in Kurdistan. And when they were taking her away, she pleaded with the security forces not to take her. She said, "I'm a stranger in this town. Please don't take me." And I think this image really resonated with Iranians across the country who became so angry at this senseless death. For women who spend their lives being afraid of being stopped by the morality police, and for men who care about the women in their lives because they really identified with this situation and they identified with Mahsa's brother who was with her. I think I read a tweet at the beginning, and when this first happened, and this young man was saying how he really identified with the brother. He was arrested and telling the story of how he was in protests because he identified with the brother, and how can this brother continue to live with himself after having been with his sister, and his sister was taken away like that and killed. A couple of other things that happened around this death really resonated with people that has since resulted in 3 months of national protests. One was a picture of, first of all, a picture of Mahsa laying in bed with tubes hanging out of her face. She couldn't breathe, and I think people just felt really angry about that, and the level of, the continued impunity with which security forces unleash violence on ordinary citizens and kill them, and are never ever held responsible and never take any responsibility. The other issue that really resonated with Iranians was this picture of her family hugging in this empty corridor of the hospital. Both of these pictures went viral using the internet. So this is where the internet is really important in these protests. And people immediately identified with that. There were a couple of other issues that led to this case becoming a national issue. This was not the first case with morality police being extremely violent with women, but this resonated on different levels. The other issue was her family. Her family really responded in a steadfast manner. The security forces immediately said, she died of natural causes, she had a heart attack, she had epilepsy, all of the regular excuses. And her family steadfastly denied all those claims and said that she was a healthy young woman and she died because she was beaten. And witnesses corroborated that. They refused pressure from the security forces to bury her at night and privately. They made sure that her body was taken to Saqqez and buried. And around that burial, protests erupted. And the women at that protest, Kurdish women in the city of Saqqez, took off their headscarves and they chanted something that I think also really resonated with Iranians. They said in Kurdish, I'm translating, that, death for a headscarf, how much of this humiliation will we endure? And at the same time, protests broke out in other cities in Kurdistan. Student groups announced protests. Women's groups announced protests. And I think that the combination of these factors really resonated and made people angry who were really sick and tired of having their bodies controlled, their bodies monitored in this very violent way. Another thing later happened, I think is important, that is a chant that is a Kurdish chant, Jin Jihan Azadi, emerged at one of the funeral services, memorial services. And this has become the chant for the entire uprising. And I think it signifies something very much in opposition to what people feel that the Islamic Republic stands for. Totally the opposite of life, women, freedom, or women, life, freedom. I said it. That this is what Iranians want. They want to have. And especially the young women and the women, they want to be able to make decisions about their own bodies, about their own lives. They are trying to live and to insist on the right to live a life that is free and determined by they themselves. And I think these are the messages from this protest. But these protests are significant on multiple levels, and I'm going to list some of those levels. First of all, this is the very first time ever that we've had a national protest that started out demanding justice for a woman killed in custody. And it's the very first protest that, at least at the beginning, was centered around a demand for women's rights. So initially the demand was the elimination of laws that require mandatory hijab, and also the forceful, violent monitoring of women's bodies, control of women's bodies. Now, these protests have gone on for 3 months, and the demands of the protesters have changed. And I think when you watch videos from these protests, you often see, especially the young people involved in these protests, that they're chanting repeatedly, Azadi, 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 freedom, freedom, freedom. And this is, I think, the main message that we can take from these protests, is that people who are out there, they're willing to risk their lives because they want freedom. They want to live out their aspirations to the best of their abilities. And especially the young people involved in these protests, they have a very different image and different idea about their future than the Islamic Republic has. And so they're tired of being told what to do, how to do it, and especially the young people. I think the young people involved in these protests, the Generation Z, they can probably connect to their counterparts internationally much more than they can connect to Iranians inside the country in terms of their aspirations for their lives. I think a couple of other points are really significant about these protests. While these protests, which are now national and are demanding fundamental freedoms, fundamental change, serious political change. In many instances, people are asking for regime change. Women are still very central to these protests. Young people are very central. University students are very central, and even high schoolers and younger are central and participating in these protests. And this is the first time that we see this young generation of Iranians participating in these protests. This is a group that nobody had ever thought about before. Not government planners, not movements. Nobody had thought about them. And here they are. They're expressing themselves and what they want, and we're hearing for the first time what they want. These protests are also different because they're national. This is not the first national protest we've had since 2009. People talk about that. We've had 2 major national protests, 2017 and 2019, but they were largely around economic issues. This is really about fundamental freedoms. They're national, and this is the first time that we see the reemergence of the middle class in national protests, because they weren't as prominent and as participating as much in the 2017 and 2019 protests. So they've come back. And this is an intersectional protest. So you have people of different ages, of different socioeconomic backgrounds. You have them across different cities, in rural areas and in big urban areas. You have also, it's intersectional in the sense that it's different ethnic groups, different religious groups, LGBT groups, and all are participating and demanding very, very similar things. Again, freedom, freedom, freedom. It's and it also, this protest also gets support from a variety of different movements, including the student movement, the women's movement, the workers' movement. So you see people coming together for these protests. One really important thing about these protests that I think people should pay attention to is the decentralized nature of how they organize. They're organized locally. There's not one charismatic leader or a group of charismatic leaders. People talked about this initially, and even I did, as a weakness. But actually, this is the strength of these protests. This is why they've lasted so long. Their protests are very creative. They're creative in strategies. So every time something happens that stops the protests, people come up with new strategies that keep it going. For example, when Sharif University was attacked, when students were holding protests, the next day you saw high schoolers out in the streets protesting, or their pictures published protesting and, asking for this, making the same demands. Or now that, people, we see artists engaging in public art to sort of carry this message. So when protests die down, their people are carrying the message of the protests and the protesters in different way. They're peaceful. All of the people in the streets involved in this protest are not carrying guns, they're not killing people. The majority of the violence is coming from security forces, and there's been a lot of violence. And these protests are also really creative in their use and creation of art. We have seen a flourishing of art, pictures, anthems. That's just amazing, and I think it's a subject for study for many, many years to come. Now, these protests didn't happen overnight, really. This is the result of decades of work from especially all the movements, but especially the women's movement. When we started talking about violence over 20 years ago, we couldn't talk about violence against women. We had to always preface it by saying that, we're not intending to make the state look bad, we're not intending to give a negative image. But here, people are so outraged by the violence that Mahsa faced all across the country that they're rising up. And this is the result of the work of the women's movement. And also all those characteristics that I listed are similar to the characteristics of the women's movement. The women's movement is also nonviolent. It's also been really creative in terms of its strategies because it's faced repression for decades and has to constantly come up with new ways to express itself and to keep going. It's creative in the use of arts. And most importantly, again, the women's movement has worked very hard to organize in a decentralized manner and has struggled within itself for years. We've had fights even about this, but I'm very proud of this, is that we have rejected the notion of a charismatic leader. And so I think it's important for people watching from the outside not to be in a hurry to list a leader, especially those from outside, because there are many, many leaders inside the country, and you don't see anybody inside the country really yelling out the names of people who have been recognized as leaders outside the country. So I think it's very important to recognize that this movement, similar to the women's movement, is really investing in a collective effort, and they realize that this collective effort is the one that's going to pay off, and it's important. And lastly, I want to say that, while this is not, we've had really great involvement from the different ethnic groups, especially the Kurdish community, in terms of keeping these protests alive. They were the first place that the protests happened, and they've consistently continued to protest and just sort of given a new breath and new dimensions to these protests with their slogans, with their taking off their hijabs, all of this. this is not a sectarian protest. It is a national protest all across the country. But nevertheless, the different ethnic groups are paying an extremely high price in these protests, both the Kurdish community and the Baluchi community, that of the 400 and something killed, half of them are from these two ethnic groups. I think it's really important. The Islamic Republic tried to make this into an ethnic issue and create ethnic divisions so that it could crack down and stop the protests, but fortunately it wasn't successful in doing so. In Baluchistan, just in one day, Friday prayer goers, in 1 hour actually, over 100 of them were shot, most of them shot in the back as they were running away from the bullets. They were connecting to the protests, making the same demands, but they were also very angry about a young woman who had allegedly been raped in Baluchistan, a young Baluchi woman, and they were marching to the police station to ask for accountability, and 100 of them were killed in 1 hour. They were peaceful, unarmed, and I think it's important to sort of recognize that while these are not sectarian protests, that these two ethnic minority communities who have long been discriminated against and been treated through a securitized lens are paying an especially high price. Also, I just want to mention two other factors that are really important. Just that a lot of women human rights defenders and a lot of human rights defenders have been arrested. Over 170 human rights defenders have been arrested. Women human rights defenders have been arrested. And this is significant because we already had over 50 women human rights defenders in prison already serving long prison terms. So I'm going to stop there. Sorry about that.
Apologies, Sussan. No, but thank you very much for painting this very, very vivid picture of what the protests are and how they started with the death of one woman, becoming a woman-led movement, but ultimately becoming a feminist revolt and saying what it makes it feminist, including minorities, the very different walks of life of Iranians that are being involved, and making it an intersectional protest, as you say. So while we keep this, rather encouraging picture, we still also have to hear, and I want to ask Farzad Seyfi-Karan, who as a journalist for Radio Zamani has been following the protests and especially the crackdown. What is it that you're seeing? How is the repression playing out? What is actually, besides the headline numbers that we know, what is going on inside the country?
Thank you so much for organizing this event and inviting us. Actually, I want to talk about the high level of the violence during the protest that the Iranian security forces used against the protesters. And but before this, I want to start my speech with a quote of a. You don't hear it?
You speak louder.
Okay.
Louder. It's okay.
Okay. Now it's better?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Okay,
good. Sorry. I started my speech with a quote of a child. His name is Kian Pir Falak. He said, "In the name of the God of Rainbow." And that is a very special quote for me because Kian was a 9-year-old child that was killed by the security forces in a small town of Iza in the Khuzestan province. And this is actually show everyone about talking about the violence in the protests of Iran during these 3 months. The security forces shot at their cars for no reason. This is just one example of the high level of violence. When I covering the reports and talking with some sources in Iran, actually I see a different method and systematic violence that the Iranian government and especially the security forces use against the protesters. When I talk about the security forces, I mean different group like police and militias in Iran. For example, normal police we have, and also special unit forces or Yegan Vijay, that means anti-riot, Basij, IRGC, and Nakhsa, and some other groups. Then we have many groups that in Iran working on security forces. Then all these military and paramilitary groups are involved in suppressing popular protest and using violence, arresting the people and killing them. They are armed forces, all of them. And as Sussan also mentioned, and Iranian human rights organization have announced during these 3 months more than 400 protesters killed in Iran, including 16 children. And that's a huge number of the unarmed protesters in Iran killed, and that was horrible. And the security forces use a combination of weapons, and that is so important that we know about it, because in these weapons, including the lethal and non-lethal weapons, but the issue is that even the non-lethal are used with such force that they end up resulting in serious injury or death. For example, in the cases of Sarina Esmailzadeh in Karaj, or Nika Shakarami in Tehran, or Sarina Saedi in Sanandaj, all of them was 16-year-olds, so young, were killed because of repeated beating by baton and resulting in severe head injury. In the second level, various security forces use a combination of weapons which are not the usual anti-riot weapons, because the anti-riot weapons are non-lethal weapons. But they are considered to be war weapons, which are for example, include some semi-automatic shotguns, which use different type of bullets that are deadly, or AK-47 gun is a Russian weapon, or handguns. We can see this type of weapons from the videos and images that published from the protests. We have seen also that the security forces using this type of the deadly weapon, and in different areas also, the security forces have used different methods and different deadly weapons. For example, in Kurdistan, in the city of Javan, Rud, Mahabad, Bukan, and Sanandaj, that during 3 days of the protest, more than 47% were killed through use of war weapons like machine guns, Russian machine guns, the name is Dushka, and IRGC used this. In other ways, actually, some of the shotguns, like Benelli M2 and Benelli M4, is made by Italy, and some of the ammunition used that IRGC and security forces use against the protester, manufactured in a European country. This is according to a Dutch expert. I spoke with him. And so that is, I think, our main question about this violence, because is how does the IRGC or security forces access to these war weapons from the Europe when they used against the protester, because it is sanctioned, and till now I cannot find a good answer for this. We have many examples for the violence during these 3 months. For example, in the video that show killing a young man, the name is Mehdi Hazrati, he was 16 years old. The security forces shot him with the shotgun. Or Komar Darofdade, he was also 16 years old and killed with the shotgun in Piran Shahr, in very close distance. And we see also that the special anti-terror forces, they call it NOPO, they used also Russian sniper in Karat City against the protester. Then we can see the different deadly weapons during these 3 months, or the high-level violence against the protester. We can see that, for example, in Sanandaj, a video published that shows the protesters swimming in the rivers, and the security forces shot her, a girl swimming in the river, and the protester shot her. It was like a sense of the movie, actually. It's unbelievable. But for the first time in Iran, we have also protests in the schools, and students also joining the protest, and security forces also going to the schools, beating the students, and shot the tear gas on the schools, and that is also unbelievable. But it is not the whole story of the security forces against the protester, because they impose repression on the citizens in the different level. In many cases, they even destroy people's cars and houses because they want to make a pressure them economically, in the addition to the risk of being arrested and killed. And in the end, I want to finish my speech by thanking the Iranian citizen journalists, because if it wasn't for them, we wouldn't know about the protest and the severe repression. They even risked their lives to be the voice of the people. And during this protest, some of the journalist citizens was killed also, like a girl in the northern province in Iran. The name is Ghazal Chalabi. Yeah.
Thank you, Farzad. Thank you very much for recounting these stories, and for also giving a voice, you yourself, to the journalists who are still working from inside the country. It is very important that you can do this. It is important that you can be here and speak out, reminding Europe, among the many things, but reminding them, for example, of where do all these weapons come from, and the ammunition that you mentioned. And I'm sure there is a need for more investigation in how this is possible. Third, coming to Tara Sepehri Far, who is the senior Iran expert at Human Rights Watch. We heard from Sussan about what sparked the protests. We heard from Farzad how they are being repressed, how they are being put down. Let's look at the judicial work that is out there, the trials that are going on, the very urgent human rights concerns that you have. Tell us more about this, please.
I want to just echo the thanks to the panelists and members of the European Parliament who've given us this opportunity. As was mentioned, this event was planned before, but I think as many people inside the country, including sociologist Saeed Madani, anticipated, all the elements for widespread protest existed. And the period between widespread protest has been shrinking over the past 4 years. So I think taking a chance to look at the urgent situation on the ground while keeping in mind that this is a long-term process that requires medium and long-term planning and thinking is very important. Another pillar of, just responding to your question, Farzad explained very well the very lethal and brutal tactics that security officials are using to repress the protest. Another pillar of their crackdown has been mass arrests of protesters, and we have estimates of above 18,000 people who have been arrested over the past 3 months, as well as a full-on assault on peaceful dissent and arrests of human rights defenders, journalists, lawyers, public figures, athletes, actors who've been either arrested or summoned or put on under a travel ban for voicing their support for the protest. The situation in detention centers are of grave concern. We know first and foremost they're overcrowded. Access to basic needs are restricted, but also the level of abuse, torture, including sexual harassment and sexual assault, seems to be significantly higher than previous rounds of protests that we have documented. Authorities are now moving forward very quickly with trials that are falling grossly short of international standards. And let me elaborate why we use this adjective. Those who are detained do not have access to a lawyer of their choice because they're facing national security charges. And they are put under immense pressure, including torture, to confess against themselves and incriminate themselves. Volunteer groups that are working on this issue have documented at least more than 35 cases that the charges of muharebe and corruption unearthed that can carry the death penalty have been brought against those who are arrested in connection to the protest, either in the protest or related to the protest. What's particular, including children, by the way, which is very concerning. What's also particularly concerning about these cases is that Iran is one of the leading implementers of the death penalty around in the world. Europe has a very strong track record of raising concern about the use of death penalty by Iran and coordinating multilateral pressure to push back on that. In the previous cases of protests and those who were executed by authorities, almost all of them were facing charges related to alleged killing of security officers. In 2019, we saw the cases of 3 young protesters who were facing charges and were sentenced to executions for widespread destruction of public property. With domestic and international pressure, Iran's Supreme Court overturned those. Here, now in this round of protests, we're seeing a more expansive use of those 2 charges for alleged crimes that have nothing to do with intentional harming of security officers. So there are charges for alleged killing of security officers, as well as acts such as closing a highway, quote unquote, terrorizing the population. Extremely vague definition of what constitutes these charges, and that's an escalation and very concerning. The other element of that, as I mentioned, is that children under the age 18 have faced those charges. Most recently, there was a trial related to the killing of a member of alleged killing of a member of Basij. 15 defendants were brought to the court. 3 of them were under the age 18. There were 17. And under Iran's criminal procedure law, they should be tried separately in juvenile courts. Yet, judicial authorities played around regulations, gave revolutionary court judges credentials for juvenile court to try children alongside adults. And just to show the level of what a travesty of justice these trials are. The trial for 15 people lasted only one session, as far as we know, and after that one session at least, 5 death sentences have been handed down, and others are facing lengthy prison sentences. For the ones we know that they've been subjected to extreme torture. One of the cases of a doctor, actually, Hamid Qare Hassanlu. We are slowly coming up with names and trying to put faces before these massive numbers and the scale of repression. He was a doctor, and he's one of the people who has apparently been sentenced to execution. And signs of tortures on his body are just shocking, and he's actually currently hospitalized, going under serious treatment, and the sentence was communicated to him while he was on a hospital bed. So authorities are very much in a rush. It appears that they're very much in a rush to move forward with these execution and these trial processes. And I think that's an area that we really need EU to stand firm and bring unilateral pressure on Iran. And by that, I know we've considered questions of engagement. We do need member states to really coordinate through embassies on the ground, as well as all different for international forums, including the United Nations, but also multilateral pressure. Because while we have spoken about this positive energy and how people from all walks of life are uniting, we are, as members of civil society, are worried about an extreme period of repression, and we really want EU to communicate to Iran very specific human rights demands that are part of Iran's, frankly, responsibility, but also Iran needs to be pressed to not move forward with these executions.
Thank you. We'll get back to that and to a little more detail. But before, I want to bring in Mona Mir Sattari, who is from the Université Saint-Louis at Bruxelles, to give us this diaspora perspective on the protests. We've heard from inside the country a lot. We've heard from those who pursue the human rights cases. What is going on in the Iranian diaspora that you are part of and that you're working with?
Thank you, Cornelius, John. Now you're part of the Iranian community, so it's fine. We are here to talk about a woman-led movement started with the death of Mahsa Amini for not properly wearing her veil. And this is when the hashtag Woman Life Freedom began. But this revolt is going far beyond than that. It is converging social battles behind this cause of women. It is like a box of Pandora, we can say. And it has been like this for almost 3 months already, without any real leader figure even. So we have seen that the people are still continuing. They are not getting tired. They will continue anyway. And this is how Sussan has really covered it very well, how it is a woman-led movement. And we have seen a new generation, new demands, new forms of action. It is an obligation of the hijab as a religious, political, and ideological question, as it is a symbol of the repressive and unequal policy which created a systematic sexual segregation. It is a battle against the mandatory hijab because it stands for the whole repression of women. Take away the mandatory hijab and you take away the identity of the Islamic regime of Iran and their legitimacy to control women and families. But as said before, it goes way further than this. There is much more. So, of course, I will not go into that again, but it was very well said. This movement has 2 layers. There is the people inside of the country, nationally, And then you have also an international perspective through the Iranian diaspora. I am the daughter of 2 Iranian refugees that had to flee the country after the Iranian Revolution of 1979. And unfortunately, they have never been able to return to their country of origin. So I was born in Belgium, and I had myself never the opportunity to see my country of origin. And I have never been to Iran. This is why I cannot speak for the people in Iran today, but it has been done very well today by the other speakers, which I thank. However, I could speak for the diaspora, because as you have people that have been forced to flee their country because of their recent actions in Iran, you also have people that cannot go back because of their actions here, in Europe, for instance, such as me. And these people didn't cut their ties with their country, the culture, the language. They also feel Iranian. And this is why it is also important for them to stay active outside of the country. From here, from Brussels, the heart of Europe. And these people are very active now, even though maybe some of them were never active before. So we see now that people are joining the movement, European youth, for example, or even people that really had nothing to do with that. Like some of the people in these actions that we see, for example, in Brussels, they are young mothers. Everyone has a 9-to-5 job, and they do all of this on a voluntary basis after their work, because it is so important for them to stand with the people of Iran. They are volunteers, but we see that even there, women are taking much more place around the table here, and that is very important, and that has to stay like this. But this diaspora also feels a little bit left alone sometimes, because they don't feel heard. They don't feel that here, I mean, when I say here, I mean outside of Iran, non-Iranians are sometimes not even aware of the situation, of what is actually happening in Iran. My own friends, they don't know. They know a little bit by things that I put on social media, but that's it. So I ask myself, people that don't have an Iranian friend, how do they get this information? You really have to go and search actively, because otherwise, to be honest, the Western media is not covering enough. It's the truth. And that's why people are not aware. And that's why sometimes you feel that you are in 2 battles. You are at home, you are making all these calls and doing whatever you can, you put all your energy, and then you come outside, you go to your job, and people don't know what you have been through before. So this is also a side of the story. And this comes through media, for instance. It might be partly due to a lack of interest in Middle Eastern matters, it could be, but mostly due to a lack of accurate information. Sometimes they do want to cover it, but they don't know what is actually going on, because simply the information doesn't go most of the time outside of Iran. And for that, the most important part is internet access. We need for the people in Iran to hear our voice here, and also the other way around. That's how we can motivate each other and stand together. And only together we can be heard within the international and European community. But when we are talking about internet access, we also mean a safe internet access. So that means also being connected with each other without a fear of being persecuted. People are scared to communicate with Iran. Everyone here has family in Iran. And sometimes we just prefer not to contact them just to keep them safe. So this is also something that the EU should definitely address. I was invited to speak at the European Parliament's Human Rights Subcommittee at the very beginning of the protests, so in September. And there I was asking the members of the European Parliament to take targeted actions. Actions where the Iranian population would not become the victim, as we have seen before. And so this was almost 3 months ago. And well, here I am, almost 3 months later, saying the same things again. And so will I again in 3 months if I have to. I will not repeat the same speech again, but I could. Literally. I mean, it's on YouTube, you can also just go and watch it. But I could really now just take the same text again. So I'm not here to ask you to support us this time. I am here to tell the EU that they must stand with the people of Iran with proper actions. Let's work together for a free Iran with respect for universal human rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mona, for your perspective and for getting us into this very concrete discussion about what needs to be done. We have heard 4 very different perspectives to give us a better understanding, a better picture of what is going on in Iran. But I guess the question on everyone's mind is that, but what next? What is it that can be done concretely? And I want to ask this question again to the panelists, starting with you, Sussan, knowing that individually and as a group, you have worked on what are the concrete asks, concrete proposals that could be made in public to the European Union. What is it that they could follow up on in order to have an impact, and so that we're not having the same conversation in 3 months again? Sussan.
So we've said this several times during the last few days, so I'll say it. I apologize to people who are hearing it over and over again. But one really important thing that can be done by the European Parliament and the member states is to very clearly and specifically and concretely express demands on human rights to Iranian authorities, and make sure that you use every opportunity to make that expression and that demand heard, especially, responding to the urgent human rights situation in Iran, the execution sentences, asking for the release of human rights defenders and women human rights defenders. Pretty much everybody we know, either personally or through your reputation, has been arrested in a preemptive manner. This was actually said by the judiciary head, that in order to deal with these protests, we have to take a preemptive approach. And everybody who has done any sort of human rights work, whether they're lawyers, journalists, human rights women activists, that could potentially play a role in continuing the protests, have been targeted and arrested, many of them in their homes. So it's really critical that the EU expresses dissatisfaction in this respect, making sure that trials are fair. If you can have observers at the trials, that would be essential. Demanding that prisoners are treated that they're released, but especially protesters, but that they're treated well in prison, that their health doesn't come under pressure, they don't lose their health, and especially that they are not subject to mental health and mental torture, because we're hearing stories about these young people who aren't activists. So many young people in their 20s and their teens have been arrested, and they're having a hard time dealing with the situation in prison. They're facing a lot of pressure, and some have committed suicide after their release. So this is really important. And then I think, looking at this is the urgent response, but in terms of the long-term response, I think it's essential that Europeans really set aside or clearly identify what their values and their asks are on human rights and hold everybody, especially in this region, which is a highly a region of great violators of human rights, and make sure that everybody is held to the same account. And I think that will go a long way in ensuring human rights, not only for Iran, but the entire region, which is critical. I work on the region, so countries like Egypt, Turkey, Israel, Saudi Arabia, it's essential that they're held up to the same standards. And, you know, I don't know if you want me to talk about the other things that we talked about, or if you want to give other people an opportunity. So the other issue that we came up with collectively, this delegation that's here, is that civil society groups that have deep knowledge and deep roots inside the country are engaged in a meaningful way by the EU. There are many of these groups have worked on human rights, on women's rights for decades, and understand what's going on in the country, and it's essential that we're engaged in a way that we can provide input into policies, and we're consulted with. I know that there's no serious official programs, but I think that given this crisis, it's really important that we do that happens, and that, you know, for the long term, that there's cooperation with civil society that works to break the isolation of Iranian civil society, and especially the women's movement. This is something that we do at Femina, we try to do at Femina, and I hope that the European Union will also be committed to breaking that isolation, because it would be great to have people from inside the country in spaces like this speaking on their own behalfs. And it's not us in the diaspora. Even though we've worked in the country, I would gladly give up this space to people who are coming from inside the country to be able to do that. And lastly, providing support to women human rights defenders and human rights defenders who are in need, making sure that if they need to leave the country, they can do so safely, that neighboring countries guarantee their security when, you know, they're crossing over borders. They don't turn them back over to the security forces, especially those whose lives might be in danger, and guarantee their safety in those third countries, but then also making sure that they have support and they have rapid relocation to other countries where they'll be safe. I think that's really, along those lines, also making sure that anybody from the diaspora community who doesn't have residency or a status in Europe is also safe and is not deported back. And this is, I know member states have to work on this, but I think it's a critical ask that can happen.
Thank you. And maybe also on Farzad's behalf, giving a question to you, Tara, about the very real human rights abuses inside the country. When we speak of Europe, we mostly mean the European Union, but there are 27 member states who do have delegations also on the ground. Does that help or hinder your work? How is it that you can find allies with EU member states in order to work on these cases that you have to deal with?
I didn't expect to be in this position to answer questions. I thought we were here to raise demands and have the members of European Parliament answer, but I'll try. So I think there are advantages and disadvantages to that. I think the collective voice of EU carries a certain level of legitimacy and power that cannot be discounted. And it's important to take advantage of that united and collective voice to communicate these extremely serious concerns to Iran. But then I think it's also an advantage to use specificities of bilateral relationships to use every opportunity to pressure Iran to respond to these demands. And I think I'm raising that because I think that the relationship, I know UK is not part of the European Union, but still very closely coordinating Iran policy with the EU. The nature of relationship that, for instance, Germany and Iran have, UK and Iran have versus Italy and Iran might be different. And if done in a coordinated fashion, that can strengthen the position of EU, not weaken. But I think what has been a bit more difficult for us to understand is there has been a lot of message of solidarity and support, which is great. I think Iranian people are demanding that in Iran. They want to hear that they are the center of policy right now. They want to know that the situation of human rights in Iran, the protests, authorities' response is the center of debate. But I think we are having trouble raising our demands with all the capitals and making sure that the actions that are taken are obviously with the right intention, but are taken in a coordinated fashion in a way that both raises pressure on Iran, but also does not cause any harm to civil society. And in that regard, for instance, an issue that has come up, and we have been discussing that, I think it would be very helpful as targeted sanctions are being rolled out on Iran to have a mechanism for feedback and input from those who are working intimately with civil society in Iran to make sure that there is no unintended harm on the work, the very work of people who are trying to be supported. And similarly, in terms of statement policies, so I guess the disadvantage is that coordinating all of that and making sure that the policy is united, also just the sheer volume of all the capitals, it's been difficult for us to coordinate because we're at the same time, like most of us here sitting are documenters, so we're doing the research and investigating, and at the same time advocates speaking to policymakers and asking for demand, and sometimes we just cannot keep up with the speed. We are documenting yesterday news, but I think it's very, very critical for us to strengthen our relationship, and I think it's also a public plea. Come back to human rights groups. They have the numbers, they have the evidence, they're happy to share. We're very excited about the fact-finding mission that has been established by the UN, and we very much hope that EU stays involved in making sure it's well-resourced and well-staffed that can respond to the magnitude of the crisis in Iran.
You mentioned, just in passing, you mentioned mechanisms that make your own work ultimately more difficult. Can you give us an example of where well-intended measures by the European Union and others are at cross purposes when it comes to your own work?
So specifically, I think that is the question of sanction that we're discussing. The reality is that broad sanctions are imposed by the United States, and that's an area that we have been engaging with the United States. An example of a recent exemption that was issued by U.S. Treasury to expand exemptions on technologies, an example of where broad-based sanctions were restricting Iranians from access to safe communication technologies. But the reality is that the problem of over-compliance with these broad-based sanctions extends beyond just the United States. There are also a lot of issues in the EU. I know it's the US sanction, but the EU can raise those as well. So that's an area of making sure that safe companies, technology companies, that the Europeans hearing also from EU that they should take advantage of these exemptions. They should provide services to Iranian, safe financial channels for Iranians to be able to support each other. We're not asking for foreign funding to go to Iranian protesters. Many of us would like to support our families and our friends and our struggle, yet it's extremely difficult to find secure and safe and frankly workable financial channels to send money to Iran. That's another area. And also, as targeted sanctions are being rolled out, the topic of sanctions on entities is being discussed, which is an idea that can be effective and should be considered. But I think that for the impact to be targeted, the due diligence process should include a harm assessment process as well. And civil society, again, is in a good place to share information on some of the nuances of how civil society support work is done in extremely repressive and securitized circumstances, so policymakers can have the information in order to make more accurate decisions.
Thank you, and thank you also for leading the way to how civil society can be included in very concrete processes. And I want to pass that question to Mona. You've already mentioned that you spoke in Parliament, that you've made those demands. How would you envisage the involvement, especially of the diaspora, in policy-making processes in Europe, in the European Union or in member states? What would you like to see, how this resource can be best leveraged?
So first of all, I think that the main priority, of course, still stays that, for example, the first actions, the first fundings, etc., would go, of course, first of all, to the people in Iran. These are the first frontliners. It's where it has to go in the first instance. However, in the second instance, if you want to be also included within the international and European community, you have to be having resources as well. You have to make yourself heard to be invited to these places. How do you do that? Is by doing concrete actions as well here. So the Iranian community in foreign countries have been very active since the beginning. Even before already, of course, but since the death of Mahsa Amini, they have not stopped. There have been actions every week, every day, sometimes more than once a day. There have been days where in every country they are having protests at the same time. So we have to continue this so that people would not forget the situation, that they still continue to hear our voices. But of course, there is also a limit to our capacity, and this can be helped by, for example, also some European support in that, by fundings, for example, but also more than that, continuing having this kind of debates, inviting the Iranian community to these actions. More further than that, I would, because all the actions and sections that Tara mentioned were very accurate, I can maybe add one more, since maybe myself, I work at the university and I have been a student until not that long ago. Iran has brilliant students. It's the truth. And a lot of them have been banned from these universities now for these actions, for being against the regime. The European Union could make them come here and study at our universities. And this is where also we have been trying to get the help of universities here in Belgium, for example. And the other way around, also maybe not accept some students at our universities here, because it is dangerous. So this would be a very, very good action to make, for example.
Thank you. Very, very concrete once more. We're nearing the end of our session, but I would like to use that opportunity, and Tara hinted to that, to ask our guests, our hosts, after you've heard from the guests, to maybe just give us an idea of the 1, 2, or 3 things that you're taking away from this discussion, from what you've just heard over the past hour, for your own work for the next days, weeks, and let's not say months, so days and weeks. What are you taking away, Ambassador Ronner, if I can begin with you, what are you taking away from what you've heard from the civil society here on stage?
Thank you. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to come back. There are indeed, you can see I took a lot of notes, so I listened very carefully, and there's certainly a lot that I take away from this. But if you're asking me for 2 or 3 quick points, I would like to, first of all, to come back to something I did mention, and it was also mentioned later on, but it is important that we are now, I fully understand, having had similar meetings like this one before, not only on Iran, but other countries like Afghanistan, where, of course, the situation is extremely difficult as well. But from those talks, I fully understand that there is this urge to do more. I would say that what I find really important is that we did manage to have the Human Rights Council in Geneva conclude this fact-finding mechanism. Hopefully, but this is not really in our hands, but hopefully this mechanism will be able to start its work in January. that would be great. Of course, there are a lot of things that we don't know yet, such as who will actually be, running it, and what about access? So there are huge questions there, but I think it's very important. This is really the work that we are doing, and I think it's for now, it's something that we have to really take, I think, at least some hope from. So I think it's important. The other very important thing I would like to share is I hear very much the sort of the call for the EU to be even more actively engaged in having our voice being heard by the Iranian authorities. I can first of all really share with you, but without wanting to go in all the details, of course we do have very close relations and we work on that with the United States, with the UK. This is of course work that is going on. Having said that, if there is a possibility that you can offer to provide me, us, my colleagues, with even more information, please do. I'm here, we are here. I am more than willing to continue following up, as Sussan also proposed, to really see what more can we do, can we discuss, even with a certain kind of regularity. So please do follow up on that. Come to me after this meeting today, and I'd be happy to accommodate that. Thanks.
Thank you very much. That's a welcome invitation that will be followed up on. Cornelia, Ernst, Urtasun.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. We have collected a lot of proposals, ideas, wishes, demands. And I think the first what we have to create is we should speak as the EU with one voice. This is a hard fight. It's not easy. Not in the Parliament, we know that, and not inside of the 27 member states. You know that very well. I'm happy about a lot of things that you've done in the last years, and we are on your side of the EES, but sometimes alone, you know that, yes. To speak with one voice, it would be helpful, and for you all, a big value. Second point, what I think we should discuss how can we come to a safe communication. We discussed it in these days. How can we create it? And it should be a structured dialogue between the civil society, the national and also the international diaspora, and with us. I think this is a second big point, and we should speak about technical possibilities. How can you help us, maybe? Yes, this would be a good idea that we can connect us about that. Medical help for injured protesters. This was one of big wishes from the last discussions. Funding for NGOs, to find ways for funding for NGOs. Media, I think we should discuss in another format what we can do, that we can have more information and a direct contact to the media. Impact assessment before new sanctions. Wow, yeah. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if I look at the European Parliament and the EU on whole. But okay, we know that economical sanctions are horrible and wrong and sorry, illegal. Yeah. But what is the targeting? What can we speak about exemptions? I don't know. And in this connection also we have to speak about the access to banks. And I would say the most what we need is trust among us. Trust among us, this is also not a gift. We have to develop it, and I think we done some good steps in these days, and I give the floor my colleagues.
Thank you. No, look, there's a lot of food for thought for our discussion. I will maybe mention go very much to the point 3 things. I think that we need to reflect how to better protect human rights defenders, activists, and NGOs on the ground. I was a bit, well, if you take the numbers, I was also a bit shocked to hear that the numbers of organizations in Iran on the ground have shrinked dramatically in the last years from 50,000 to just a few hundred. I think that they deserve attention, they deserve support, they deserve means of financing. And when it comes to human rights defenders, I also take with me 3 ideas which I think are very important. Firstly, those human rights defenders, when they are on trial, they have difficulties to find a proper defense, and this is something we need to reflect upon. I think this is an extremely relevant point. Second, the harassment to their families. We don't take sufficient attention to that particular issue, and I think this is important. And I also liked very much your point on the students, of really brilliant students that will not be able to continue their studies and that maybe deserve some support. So that would constitute the first element, which I think the EU has to rethink and better and strengthen how to protect people on the ground. So this would be the first thing. Second thing. We have had lots of discussions of how to deal with the Iranian authorities lately after the recent events. I take from our discussions that the EU should exercise its leverage in every occasion it can. I think this is really important. We need to exert that leverage in any occasion, not to miss any occasion to exercise it. And on that, of course, there are several issues that we need to tackle. But of course, the people that have been trialed and are at the moment under the threat of death penalty deserve a particular attention on our side in our interactions with the Iranian authorities. So I think this is second thing that I think that I take from our discussion. Exercising this leverage is of utmost importance. Thirdly, I think that there is also a feeling that the diaspora of Iran in the EU is not sufficiently heard. This is also a feeling that I have from the discussions I have had. So on that, I think that we need to better engage with the diaspora, to better put tools at their disposal to better coordinate themselves, to better express themselves, and also to be influential in the policy setting of the EU institutions. And on that, the only thing I can say is that me and Cornelia are more than happy to continue in that exercise, because I think that, well, at least together with Carnegie, but at least at the session that we had that afternoon, but also this morning, I think was a good exercise in that sense. And also, this is the third conclusion that I take. So voilà, those would be my 3 highlights, Cornelius. Thank you.
But we have also wishes, and one wish is documenting of violation of human rights in Iran. This is a very, very good tool to work with that in the European Parliament. We need this documenting. Please give us all in our hands, then can we work.
Thank you very much. Just by way of concluding, having heard this exchange of the views, insights, and ideas expressed here by our civil society representatives, and the way you responded to this, it feels like we've made a good step forward today, even in responding to some of those wishes that you made, which leaves me only with 3 big thank yous on behalf of Barbara and myself. First of all, to Ernest, to Connie for the long-standing cooperation, to Ambassador Ronner for joining us here on this panel, for representing the EU and engaging in this dialogue that is so needed. Second, and most importantly, to Mona, Sussan, Farzad, and Tara, as well as the rest of the group, which has been sitting together for the past 24 hours and working on these issues. It's been great to have you here in Brussels, at the heart of EU policy making, and it is really something that also provides us with new hope and new impetus for the work that we are doing. Speaking of work, my third thank you goes to the teams behind the scenes that you haven't seen at Carnegie Europe. I see Malte Peters, most importantly, without him, many of the people who got into town wouldn't have gotten into town. Your own teams, Karin, Katharina, I see Frederick, and the teams that you have worked with. Sorry. Laura. So thank you very much. And that's it. We hope to continue, and we look forward to continuing the discussion and the work. Thank you very much.
Very good. Thank you.